Well, today was the last day of the 5th African Petroleum Congress, an exhibition taking place in Libreville.To. To discuss this and elaborate on the theme of perspectives for hydrocarbons in Africa, joining us from our studio in Libreville is Rolake Akinkugbe. He's the head of oil and gas research at Ecobank. She's the head of research at Ecobank Group. Thank you so much for joining us. So let's just take a look at one of the comments that came through from Angola's Minister of Oil, basically saying that the globe could benefit from the oil and gas reserves that are in Africa right now, but the continent doesn't quite know how big these reserves are. Do you think that all the exploration that is taking place to determine the size of reserves is being taken about and being executed in the right way?
That's a very interesting question because, as we know, Africa contributes around 8 or 9% of global hydrocarbons reserves. There is a great deal of exploration going on in Africa. Almost all of coastal Africa right now has some form of exploration going on. So there is definitely interest. And we're not just talking about conventional hydrocarbons here. We're also seeing increasing levels of exploration interest in pre-salt basins in places like Angola, in Gabon, in Congo-Brazzaville. So there is a lot of activity, and that has been spurred on by new frontier discoveries and the new gas producers, such as in East Africa, for instance. So there is a high level of exploration going on at the moment.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the role of intra-regional cooperation between governments, do you think that governments, especially in light of the gas finds in Mozambique and the supposed oil reserves in Kenya, we know there's oil reserves in Uganda, do you think that specific regional governments are looking to cooperate and understand the importance of cooperation?
I think they need to cooperate. If you look at what's happening today globally, Africa's hydrocarbons exports to North America are actually dropping. So there's going to be a need, and they might drop by up to 40% this year. There'll be a need to build regional markets on the continent in order to absorb this spare capacity that African countries will be producing. We've had regional cooperation before on oil and gas projects such as the West Africa Gas Pipeline, the Mozambique Southern Africa Pipeline, and now I think the new producers in East Africa, such as Kenya, Mozambique and Tanzania, need to find ways of cooperating. There needs to be political will and commercial will, because investors are attracted to projects that exploit economies of scale, and those are the types of projects that will be quite critical. A simple question such as, do we build a new refinery in Kenya as opposed to Uganda? Those decisions are not just going to be political and strategic, but they need to make commercial sense. So there is a real need for governments to cooperate. So governance will absolutely be key to the success of such projects.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just looking at, that it would certainly help the likes of, if you're talking about East Africa, those countries very reliant on oil imports, and their current account deficits certainly reflect that. I mean, we know in South Africa we had China and South Africa signing on a new oil refinery here, so that really on the downstream side of things, and that China playing a key role in investment here. So who's investing in all this infrastructure right now? I mean, is it easy to really break it up into international players, developed world versus developing world? I mean, what is your view on the investment space right now?
Well, historically, investment in upstream oil and gas in Africa has come through offshore financing. But we started to see, for instance, in Niger and Chad recently, the new refineries have been built by CNPC of China. The fact is, some local banks may not have the capital capabilities by themselves. So there's going to need to be cooperation. And I think the Kenya government, for Kenya's projects for the region, will be looking to public-private partnerships to drive this through. And that's going to be the only way. So that will be a combination of local commercial banks, DFIs and international financial institutions, as well as offshore funding structures, in order to perhaps share some of the risk around these large-scale infrastructure projects and ease bottlenecks that we so often see.
In order to get the private sector in, you have to have the regulatory environment set up, and it almost seems like there's still so much wrangling around what that looks like. We know it's held back Uganda when it comes to extracting oil. In Namibia, for example, you're looking at them saying, well, to what extent will state-owned enterprises have a stake in oil exploration and oil projects going forward? Do you see that as an issue that's holding back private sector investment? Or the examples of where it's
well, regulation. Yeah, absolutely. And regulation is going to be key. It can sometimes be a game changer, particularly when you look at things like the liberalization of downstream petroleum product prices and standardization of that liberalization across the region, which would perhaps create greater incentives for investors to want to build refineries. So the economics have to make sense. And the danger is that the pace of development and desire to invest is actually running far ahead of the ability of regulatory frameworks to cope. And that is going to need to be a key focus for cooperation. We're starting to see some movements now in East Africa, and we hope that governments in places like East Africa and West Africa, and certainly Southern Africa, will recognize the need for a coordinated approach in order to attract investment.